She was the pen behind Ain't No Way, one of the most haunting ballads in soul history, and her voice colored some of Aretha Franklin's greatest anthems, from Respect to You Make Me Feel Like a Natural Woman. With gospel roots and fearless songwriting, Carolyn Franklin carved out her own space in the family's legacy. Yet despite her gene, why did the woman who gave Aretha some of her most iconic songs become one of soul music's most overlooked figures? Before we can understand the tragedy of Carolyn Franklin's silence, we must return to the beginning. Born in Memphis, raised in the pulpit and the choir loft, she grew up amid both privilege and pain. Her childhood was shaped by constant relocations, her mother's untimely death, and the towering Franklin, a man admired for his sermons but infamous for his turbulent private life. Inside the Franklin home in Detroit, legends like Sam Cooke, Ray Charles, and Dinah Washington gathered for late-night jam sessions. For Carolyn, this was no ordinary household. It was a living classroom of Black America's musical elite. Music wasn't just encouraged, it was expected. Even as a child, she displayed a boldness and leadership that set her apart. So why, with all this talent, did Carolyn remain a name written in the margins of someone else's spotlight? This is the story of the forgotten Franklin. Carolyn Ann Franklin entered the world on the 13th of May, 1944, in Memphis, Tennessee, as the youngest child of Reverend Clarence LaVaughn, C.L. Franklin, and Barbara Siggers Franklin. From the very beginning, her life was shaped by both immense possibility and heavy expectation. Her father was already a celebrated Baptist minister, famous for his fiery sermons and magnetic presence, while her mother was a talented pianist and vocalist who instilled in all her children a discipline for music. For Carolyn, playgrounds and toys were never the center of her earliest memories. Instead, she grew up in an environment where pulpits, choirs, and piano rehearsals defined the rhythm of daily life. When Carolyn was only 2 years old, the family relocated north to Buffalo, New York, following her father's calling to preach. This was just one of many moves dictated by the demands of C.L. Franklin's ministry. Constant relocation meant Carolyn rarely felt rooted in one place for long, and it instilled in her a resilience that she would carry into adulthood. Eventually, the family settled in Detroit, where C.L. accepted a permanent position as pastor. This decision not only changed the trajectory of the Franklin family, but also influenced the entire landscape of gospel and soul music. Yet Carolyn's childhood was not defined only by privilege. In 1952, when she was just 8 years old, her mother Barbara died suddenly of a heart attack. The loss devastated the family. Irma, Cecil, Aretha, and young Carolyn were left under the care of their father, a man whose charisma in the pulpit often clashed with his turbulent private life. From that moment on, Carolyn grew up in a home full of contradictions, surrounded by great voices and legendary gatherings, yet shadowed by grief and family complexity. The Franklin residence in Detroit became legendary in its own right. Their mansion on LaSalle Boulevard functioned as both a family home and a gathering place for Black America. King, Clara Ward, Dinah Washington, and Ray Charles were regular guests, often performing impromptu jam sessions after church revivals or recording tours. For Carolyn, these weren't extraordinary moments, they were her daily reality. Where most children might play outside with neighbors, her playground was filled with icons whose voices defined a generation. In such an environment, music wasn't just an influence, it was an expectation. From her earliest years, Carolyn revealed a strong sense of leadership and determination. She sang in the New Bethel Baptist Church choir, where her booming gospel voice stood out among the congregation. Classmates later remembered her as bold, athletic, and even intimidating, a young girl who wore the Franklin name like a badge of confidence. Mary Wilson, who would later co-found the Supremes, recalled auditioning for a girl group. Carolyn Wilson described her as streetwise, earthy, and always the leader, a personality who commanded attention long before she ever commanded a stage. Life under her father's roof was far from simple. Reverend Franklin was admired nationwide as the man with the million-dollar voice, but his personal life often made headlines for all the wrong reasons. His philandering and domineering presence created tension within the home. For Carolyn, growing up in such a household meant navigating the constant pull between pride in her family's prominence and the pressure of its contradictions. By her teenage years, Each Franklin sibling was already shaping a musical path. Irma pursued gospel, and R&B. Aretha quickly emerged as the prodigy everyone spoke about, and Cecil would eventually manage Aretha's career. Carolyn, as the youngest, was still seeking her identity. Unlike Aretha, whose talent was carefully nurtured and celebrated, Carolyn's own ambitions were often overlooked or overshadowed, seen as an inevitable comparison to her sisters. Still, she refused to fade quietly into the background. After attending Detroit's prestigious Cass Technical High School, Carolyn made a bold move by setting her sights on higher education, an unusual decision for someone from a family of performers. She enrolled at the University of Southern California to study music, balancing her academic training with regular trips to New York. There, Aretha and Irma were chasing recording contracts, and Carolyn, determined to test her own path, recorded several singles under the stage name Candy Carol. Though these early efforts failed to attract attention, they revealed Carolyn's willingness to carve her own way in the industry. In many ways, her journey reflected the duality that would follow her throughout her life. At once, a Franklin with all the advantages of name and access, and simultaneously a young woman fighting to be seen as more than just Aretha's little sister. By the time she reached adulthood, Carolyn had lived through profound loss, seen the contradictions of fame up close, and tested the waters of her own ambitions. She was the daughter of a celebrated preacher, the sister of a rising superstar, and the child who bore both the blessings and burdens of a dynasty. These early years reveal a girl marked by resilience, ambition, and defiance. She had tasted both privilege and pain, and even when her attempts at independence faltered, she refused to disappear. Beneath the weight of comparison and expectation, Carolyn carried a determination to find her own light, a voice that demanded to be heard, even if the world wasn't ready to listen. By the late 1960s, Carolyn Franklin was no longer content to be a supporting player in the background of her family's legacy. Having sung in choirs, studied music at USC, and experimented with singles under the pseudonym Candy Carol, she wanted to claim her. In 1969, she signed with RCA Records, one of the most prominent labels in America, at a time when the company was eager to expand its black music division. For Carolyn, the deal felt like destiny, a chance to step into the spotlight, to finally escape the ever-lengthening shadow of her sister Aretha. Her debut album, Baby Dynamite, arrived in May 1969. The title alone suggested a fiery. Critics noted immediately that Carolyn's sound was different from her sister's. Irma carried a smooth, jazz-tinged approach, while Aretha embodied the gospel blues fusion that electrified audiences across the globe. Carolyn, in contrast, possessed a raw and commanding delivery, a voice that was less polished but more visceral. There was an edge in her tone, a kind of unrefined passion that revealed a deeply emotional core. If Irma was elegance and Aretha was power, Carolyn was grit, an untamed force brimming with honesty. Yet, the commercial success Carolyn hoped for never materialized. Baby Dynamite did not chart, and her subsequent recordings with RCA struggled to gain traction. The industry, enamored with Aretha's meteoric rise, seemed uninterested in offering space for another Franklin voice. To many executives, Carolyn's talent was impressive but redundant. They already had. Still, the failure of her solo records did not erase her significance. In fact, her contributions behind the scenes were shaping some of the most defining sounds of the era. From the moment Aretha signed with Atlantic Records in 1967, Carolyn became indispensable to the so-called Franklin sound. Alongside Irma, she offered harmonies steeped in gospel tradition, voices that wrapped around Aretha's leads like a... These weren't just background vocals, they were the backbone of an era. The call and response Fire and Respect was not only Aretha's voice transformed from Otis Redding's original, but also the echo of Carolyn and Irma, pushing it into anthem territory. In You Make Me Feel Like, a natural woman, Carolyn's harmonies provided texture, a spine of warmth and depth. On Daydreaming, her blend added a dreamlike haze that completed the sonic picture. Soul music, at its core, is a communal expression. While audiences focused on the dazzling lead singer, the power of the music often resided in the layers beneath. Carolyn's presence on those records turned solo performances into collective testimonies. Without her, many of Aretha's greatest songs would not have carried the same emotional weight. But Carolyn wasn't only a voice in harmony. She was a songwriter of remarkable sensitivity. In 1967, she wrote Baby, Baby, a ballad that stood out as one of the highlights on Aretha's Atlantic debut. The following year, she penned Ain't Nobody Gonna Turn Me Around, rooted in the gospel tradition of resilience and perseverance. These songs demonstrated that Carolyn was not satisfied with mere participation. She was carving her own creative imprint, insisting that her contributions mattered. Her most profound work came in the lyrics pleaded with vulnerability. Ain't no way for me to love you if you won't let me. For some, it was simply a tender ballad. For others, particularly later scholars, it carried coded layers of personal identity and longing, a hidden cry for acceptance. Regardless of interpretation, the song became immortal, and though Aretha's soaring vocal carried it into history, it was Carolyn's pen that gave it life. In 1973, she co-wrote Angel. This time, the track reached the top of the R&B charts, offering a softer, tender dimension of gospel-infused soul. Once again, Carolyn's fingerprints were all over a song that audiences adored even if her name was scarcely mentioned outside of liner notes. And therein lay the paradox of her career. Carolyn was both everywhere and invisible. On stage, she often stood just behind the Queen of Soul, smiling, clapping, harmonizing. In the studio, she was the architect of harmonies, the pen behind the lyrics. But in the public eye, she was a ghost. Audiences applauded Aretha, unaware of the sister who had written the words or shaped the sound. Despite the lack of recognition, Carolyn's influence remained undeniable. Her voice and her songs formed part of the DNA of soul music. She may not have had the hit records or the fame, but she was integral to an era. To call her merely a background singer was to miss the point. She was a builder, a creator, an architect of sound. Yet the cruel truth lingered. In an industry that thrives on stars, Carolyn Franklin's brilliance was filtered through someone else's light. Her rise was never hers alone. It was tethered to the gravitational pull of Aretha's legend. And while she was proud of her sister, she could not escape the painful irony that her own talents were too often treated as incidental. By the mid-1970 seconds, this tension between ambition and erasure defined Carolyn's career. She had signed with a major label, released albums, written timeless songs, and stood on stage with the greatest soul singer of all time. And still, she was overlooked. Her rise, though genuine, was never recognized for what it truly was. A struggle to be seen, a fight for identity within a family dynasty that, if Carolyn Franklin is remembered for one singular achievement, it is the song that continues to echo as one of the most breathtaking ballads in soul history, Ain't No Way. Released in 1968 on Aretha Franklin's landmark Lady Soul album, it carried within its lyrics both a universal lament and a deeply personal confession. The song is deceptively simple, Ain't no way for me to love you if you won't let me. On the surface, it speaks of heartbreak, the plea of a lover trapped by another's resistance. But beneath the melody lies something far more complex. Carolyn, known for her boldness and private struggles, poured a raw honesty into the lyrics. Some listeners took the words at face value, a classic ballad of longing. Others, especially later scholars and lines such as "Stop trying to be someone you're not" ring with layered meaning when viewed through that lens. Was Carolyn urging a lover to abandon denial, or was she, in some sense, addressing herself, acknowledging the chains of silence imposed by her family name, by church tradition, and by a society unready to accept a black woman living authentically outside its rigid expectations? The ambiguity is part of what gives. Aretha's soaring vocal brought the song to life, turning Carolyn's words into an immortal performance. The delivery was perfection. The ache in Aretha's phrasing, the restrained intensity of the backing harmonies, Carolyn and Irma once again shaping the background, created a dialogue between despair. Over the decades, it was covered by Whitney Houston, Patti LaBelle, and countless others, each version paying homage to the brilliance of its construction. Yet, Carolyn's name rarely surfaced in the public's mind. Even as the song became a standard, it was often credited in casual discussion solely to Aretha. The writer behind the curtain remained in the shadows. For Carolyn, she had proven beyond any doubt that her songwriting could stand with the greatest in the genre. She had given her sister a ballad that would define an era. But the applause flowed past her, absorbed by Aretha's crown. It was the cruel paradox of her life, to be indispensable, yet invisible. And still, the song endures. more than a half. Each note testifies not only to Aretha's incomparable voice, but to Carolyn's ability to distill vulnerability, longing, and courage into words that transcend time. In this one song, Carolyn Franklin left an indelible mark on music history, a breakthrough that revealed her genius, even if the world chose not to see it. If Ain't No Way revealed Carolyn Franklin's genius as a songwriter, then Angel confirmed her as an architect of her sister's crown. Co-written in 1973, the track became another jewel in Aretha's discography, a song that climbed to the top of the R&B charts. But behind the success lay Carolyn's unmistakable touch. Angel is not a song of thunder. It is a whisper of longing and redemption. Where Ain't No Way pleaded with unhealed wounds, Angel reached out with tenderness, offering comfort as much. In writing it, Carolyn displayed not only her lyrical gift but also a deep understanding of emotional nuance. She knew how to capture feelings both universal and intimate, how to craft words that fit seamlessly with Aretha's voice yet retained their own distinct spirit. And again, when audiences celebrated Angel, few knew that it was Carolyn's creation. The applause thundered for Aretha, but Carolyn's name remained in the liner notes, whispered among insiders, rarely spoken on stage. For Carolyn, this was the recurring story: to be central to greatness, yet rarely credited for it. Beyond her songwriting, Carolyn's harmonies defined an era. With Irma, she stood just behind Aretha on stage and in the studio, anchoring the sound that millions adored. Their voices were not accessories, they were structure. On Respect, the fiery call and response. On You Make Me Feel Like, A Natural Woman, Carolyn's harmonies wrapped the lead in warmth, turning a song of gratitude into a communal testimony. On Daydreaming, her alto added layers of texture, creating the floating atmosphere that made the track so mesmerizing. To understand Carolyn's breakthrough is to recognize that the Aretha Franklin sound was never just Aretha alone. It was the product of a family choir, with Carolyn's alto heartbeat pulse. She was the builder of bridges between gospel and pop, between the intimacy of church and the expansiveness of mainstream airwaves. But recognition rarely followed. To the casual listener, the spotlight belonged only to the Queen of Soul. Carolyn was cast as background, the supporting figure in photographs and performances, even when her pen or her harmonies had shaped the very songs that built Aretha's empire. And yet, those harmonies remain. Every time Angel soothes a listener, every time Respect ignites a crowd, every time Natural Woman brings tears, Carolyn's voice is there. It was her second great breakthrough. Not one song, but a chorus of them, sung through the blending of her gifts into a legacy that history too often forgets. Behind the harmonies and the songwriting credits, Carolyn Franklin carried a personal truth she could never fully voice. If her music was bold, her life was lived under a silence imposed by family, tradition, and the expectations of the world around her. The tension between those realities became one of the defining conflicts of her story. Friends remembered Carolyn as vibrant and funny, someone who lit up a room with her wit. Mary Wilson of the Supremes described her as streetwise and fearless, a natural leader. Yet beneath that outward confidence was a woman navigating desires and identities she could not publicly embrace. According to David Ritz's authorized biography of Aretha, Carolyn once admitted that her romantic preferences ran in a different direction from her siblings. Musician Ralph Armstrong later recalled that Carolyn was openly bisexual within trusted circles, while others, like Wilson, suggested that everyone knew, even if no one ever said it aloud. In the 1,960 seconds and 1,970 seconds, for a black woman from a prominent Baptist family, such an acknowledgement was unthinkable. Her father, Reverend C.L. Franklin, was one of the nation's most respected preachers. His pulpit reached across America, and his reputation rested on the authority of tradition. For his daughter to live openly as queer would have been scandalous. Many later critics heard in Ain't No Way more than the plea of a spurned lover. Lines like, "Stop trying to be someone you're not," took on added resonance when read through the lens of hidden identity. Whether intentional or not, the song became a coded anthem for those who knew what it meant to love in the shadows. Carolyn had the courage to put her vulnerability into words for the world, even if she could not attach her name to that truth. At times, she dated men, perhaps to project a safer narrative. For a brief period, she was romantically linked to Otis Williams of the Temptations. To outsiders, this relationship validated her normalcy, the expected script of a young woman in Detroit's music scene. But those close to Carolyn suggested it was more fleeting experiment than grand romance. The deeper connections of her life were left unspoken, sealed away behind the walls of family and the silence of necessity. The irony is devastating. Carolyn, who gave the world some of soul music's most vulnerable pleas, could not afford to be vulnerable herself. She lived at the intersection of two forces: a church that had shaped her voice but constrained her identity, and a family legacy that demanded perfection while erasing individuality. In that tension, she endured a conflict that was as personal as it was cultural. If Carolyn Franklin's personal life was shadowed by silence, her professional life was bruised by an industry that never gave her the room she deserved. By the mid-1970 seconds, the momentum she had hoped to build as a solo artist had all but evaporated. RCA, the label that once hailed her as a rising star, became the very force that delivered her most painful blow. Her final album, If You Want Me, 1976, wasn't even fully hers. Instead of supporting her with new material and promotion, RCA cobbled the project together from unused tracks, releasing it without her permission. For Carolyn, it felt like a betrayal. What had been introduced as a promising career now ended in a collection of leftovers, assembled more to close a contract than to champion an artist. The message was unmistakable. The industry had no real space for Carolyn Franklin. Even earlier, a pivotal opportunity had slipped. The soundtrack for the 1976 film Sparkle, later immortalized through Aretha's recordings, had initially been floated as a chance for Carolyn to step forward. When the project ultimately landed in her sister's lap, it became yet another symbol of how her talents were eclipsed by Aretha's towering fame. Carolyn wasn't competing with strangers. She was fighting to be seen in a family where one star's brilliance made others invisible. By that same year, the pressures proved too much. Carolyn officially retired from recording, leaving behind her dream of a career in the spotlight. There were no farewell tours, no feature stories, no final ovation, just quiet disappearance. To many, she seemed to vanish, absorbed back into the background where the Franklin sisters had long stood. But for Carolyn, it was not simply a choice to step away. It was exile, forced by a business that measured value in chart numbers and headlines rather than in art. Still, her voice did not completely vanish. For a brief time, she continued to appear alongside Aretha in the studio and on stage, her harmonies still an essential part of the Queen of Soul's tapestry. But the dream of recognition as a solo artist was gone. The tragedy is stark. Carolyn Franklin was not a failed singer. She was a gifted writer and performer who never received the backing to flourish on her own terms. The industry's narrow vision, its insistence on one star rather than a constellation, ensured that her career would be remembered not for what it was, but for what it might have been. For Carolyn, the conflict with the music business ended not with triumph, but with silence. When Carolyn Franklin passed away in April 1988, the world barely noticed. Newspapers ran small obituaries that identified her first as Aretha Franklin's sister, before mentioning her own accomplishments. To the casual reader, she was little more than a background vocalist who had quietly faded away. But those who truly understood the sound of soul music knew better. They recognized that her voice and her pen had shaped some of the greatest records of the 20th century. Her legacy is not measured in gold records or Grammy trophies. Instead, it is written in the invisible fingerprints she left across her sister's body of work. Every time Aretha sang Respect, it was Carolyn's harmonies along with Irma's that powered the call and response that transformed Otis Redding's original into a feminist and civil rights anthem. On You Make Me Feel Like, a Natural Woman, Carolyn's voice added depth and texture, giving the ballad its spine. On Daydreaming, her alto helped create the floating, dreamlike atmosphere that made the song. Baby was one of the highlights of Aretha's Atlantic debut in 1967. Ain't Nobody Gonna Turn Me Around captured the spirit of gospel resilience. Angel, which she co-wrote in 1973, soared to the top of the R&B charts, proving once again that her pen was as powerful as her voice. And of course, Ain't No Way, the ballad she wrote in 1968, remains one of the most revered songs in soul history. Covered by Whitney Houston, Patti LaBelle, and countless others, it has become a standard of vulnerability and longing. Each version, no matter how powerful, traces back to Carolyn's words. For Aretha herself, there was never any doubt about her sister's importance. In interviews, she called Carolyn and Irma the unsung heroes of her sound. Behind the crown of the Queen of Soul, her siblings knew that she was more than a background figure. She was a foundation. Over time, scholars and musicians began to re-examine her contributions. Music historians have described Ain't No Way as one of the finest ballads in the history of the genre. Writers and critics have revisited her life story, highlighting how her identity, her silence, and her work shaped her art. For many, Carolyn has become a symbol of the artists who build the stage for others to shine, only to be erased from the spotlight themselves. Yet in popular culture, she remains the forgotten Franklin. While Aretha's life has been immortalized in a Hollywood biopic, Broadway musicals, and endless tributes, Carolyn's presence is usually reduced to a footnote. Even in the 2021 film Respect, she appears only as a supporting character, acknowledged but never centered. The woman who gave Aretha one of her greatest songs still waits for her own story to be fully told. And this is the essence of why Carolyn Franklin's story matters. She was never simply Aretha's little sister. She was an architect of sound, a writer of truth, a woman who poured her longing, resilience, and brilliance into music that continues to echo today. Her legacy lives not in monuments or headlines, but in the harmonies that electrified a movement and the lyrics that cut straight to the soul. Every time Ain't No Way moves a listener to tears, Carolyn rises again. Every time Angel wraps around a heart, her hand is felt. Every time a new generation discovers the Franklin sound, they unknowingly hear Carolyn's voice woven into the tapestry. She may have been overlooked by history, but her art refuses to vanish. Carolyn Franklin's legacy is, in the end, larger than her own career. It is the story of countless artists who stand in the background, shaping history without recognition. It is the reminder that soul music was never a solo act, but a communal testimony, built on layers of voices, on writers who remained unsung, on contributions that outlived the credit given. Carolyn Franklin stands as a testament to those who deserve more than silence, to those whose light was hidden but never extinguished. Carolyn Franklin's story begins with a paradox and ends with one. She was the pen behind Ain't No Way, the quiet architect of Angel, and the voice that gave depth to some of Aretha Franklin's most iconic songs. Yet when her name appeared in newspapers after her death, it was most often as a footnote, Aretha's sister. The world applauded the crown but forgot the hands that helped shape it. Her life forces us to confront a painful truth about fame. In the music industry, brilliance is often measured by visibility, by chart numbers, by awards. But Carolyn's brilliance was quieter, embedded in the harmonies that lifted an anthem, in the lyrics that gave soul music its most vulnerable pleas. She was not a failed singer. She was an artist who built without being credited, a voice that mattered even when it was not heard in full. The irony of her journey is haunting. She wrote about longing, vulnerability, and acceptance, but could never fully live those truths in public. She dreamed of a career that never came, and when she finally stepped away, it was not out of choice, but out of an industry's refusal to make space for more than one Franklin star. Still, her legacy endures not in grand tributes or glittering accolades, but in the music itself. Every time Ain't No Way sends chills down a listener's spine, every time Angel offers comfort, her genius whispers through. She may have died young, but her influence continues to ripple outward. And so the question remains, how many Carolyn Franklins have been lost to silence? How many voices have shaped history without ever being honored for it? To remember her is to resist forgetting all those hidden stars. Carolyn Franklin was never just a shadow.